Deeply entrenched in the Bengali soul, which likes to be in continuous denial about his demise. Subhas Chandra Bose. Let us call on stage Ashis Ray and Dr. Pavan Varma. Ashis Ray is the longest serving Indian foreign correspondent, the world's senior most still active cricket commentator, having done running commentaries on BBC, ABC, Sky Sports and Sony. He has written two best-selling books on cricket and produced as many internationally acclaimed documentaries. Laid to rest, the controversy over Subhas Chandra Bose's death is his latest book. Dr. Pavan Varma is a diplomat, politician and author of a dozen best-selling books such as Dalit the Man, The Times, The Great Indian Middle Class, The Book of Krishna, Being Indian, Becoming Indian and the latest one, Adi Shankaracharya, Hinduism's greatest thinker. Please put it up for Prakar Varma as well as Ashis Ray.
Long time ago, but like you, we were also waiting. The person who was supposed to make the announcement could not be seen for this session. And when finally spotted, he said he didn't have a mic. So please forgive us for this delay. All we'll do is we'll shorten the session slightly. It's a great pleasure here to be talking to Ashis Ray on his path-breaking book, Laid to Rest, dealing with one of the most charismatic figures of the Indian freedom movement, Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose. And among the swirling controversies that continue with regard to his final months of life and years, and even the seminal question of whether he did die in the aircraft or not, air crashed or not. Ashis, whom I have known since my days as director of the Nehru Center in London, and he has been, as it was mentioned, one of the longest serving correspondents, foreign correspondents, reporting for BBC, for CNN, and Anand Bazar Patrika, the Times of India. So I used to know him in London at that time, and it's a great pleasure talking to you now. But my first question to you is, if the facts that you put in your book are so categorical and clear, what was the controversy about? Was it motivated? Was there genuine reason for doubt? Why has this controversy persisted for so long?
The reasons are, as you mentioned, all of them. But I've tried to zero in on what has triggered the problem, the genesis of it, as I would describe it. And that was the premature death of Subhas's brother, Sarat Bose. And had Sarat Bose lived a few more years, I don't think there would have been any controversy at all. Because he was not only the elder brother of Subhas, but he was Subhas's mentor. And a person who, on this subject, was the final arbiter. The fact that he passed away before Japan returned to sovereignty in 1952 was a problem, because the investigation that could have occurred officially, publicly, did not happen till 1956, and there was a reason. To go back to what happened, Subhas Bose unfortunately died as a result of a plane crash at Taipei on the 18th of August 1945. His body was cremated in Taipei as well, and the remains then taken to Tokyo, where they've been languishing now for 73 years at Renkoji Temple. Well looked after. The government of India has been paying for the preservation and upkeep of the mortal remains since the early 1950s. So there is no doubt in the Indian government's mind as to what happened. Successive governments have been exactly on the same page on this matter, whether it was the Nehru government or the Narendra Modi government. But the fact is that this is a story of neglect. We heard earlier, if you were at the opening ceremony, that the theme of this festival is crime thrillers. Well, this is a real crime committed against Subhas Bose and his wife and daughter, that you neglect one of the great heroes of the Indian freedom movement and you don't bring his mortal remains to India after so many years.
Let me ask you, and you have a personal interest in this matter, Netaji was your granduncle, Sarat Bose was your grandfather. What was the exact sequence of events that led to his death, according to your meticulous research?
Well, first of all, it needs to be remembered that Japan surrendered in the Second World War on the 15th of August 1945. And this plane crash occurred on the 18th of August. He survived the crash itself, but he died in a Japanese military hospital about 6 hours later. So what happens is this, that on the 16th, now those of you who know the history of that period and Subhas's involvement with the Indian freedom movement would know that after he left India, he had become, as you all know, twice president of the Indian National Congress, but he left the country in the early 1940s, and in the last 2.5 years of his life, he set up the Provisional Government of Free India in Singapore, and from prisoners of war, British soldiers who had been captured by the Japanese, he established the Indian National Army. Now at the end, not only did the INA campaign not succeed, but with Japan's surrender and with Bose in Singapore, there was a cabinet meeting of the Provisional Government of Free India, which decided that with Allied forces approaching Singapore and the recapture of Singapore by Britain imminent, Bose should be shifted to a safer location. And he had a plan. The plan was to slip into the Soviet Union, where he felt that he might get support, revive the movement that he had been trying to engineer, and come back at an appropriate time into the main theatre of events. So on the 16th of August, he sets off from Singapore to Bangkok. He spends the night in Bangkok, and the following day he flies from Bangkok to Saigon. So this is the 17th of August. That night, although his journey continued from Saigon, they spent the night at Da Nang, also in Vietnam, because it was getting dark, and in those days it was not advisable to fly at night, particularly on an Air Force plane. So they spent the night at Da Nang, and the following morning, the 18th morning, the flight took off and arrived around lunchtime at Taipei. Taipei was a refueling stop. There were 2 other stops thereafter planned, scheduled. The ultimate destination was Tokyo. But in between, there would be a stop in Manchuria, where a senior Japanese general who was on the flight with General Shidei would disembark because he had been transferred there to take charge of the Japanese forces in Manchuria, because the Soviet forces were approaching and the Japanese would surrender to the Soviet forces. And Shidei, being a Russian-speaking Japanese officer, he was being specially sent there so that he could negotiate a favorable surrender with the Soviets. So, although this was not officially stated, but there was every possibility that Bose would not continue to Tokyo. He would disembark with Shidei, and there had been a conversation between the two on this subject. He would disembark with Shidei in Manchuria, in Darien, and thereafter Shidei would help him to enter the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. The plane, as it took off at Taipei, crashed. He was sitting below fuel tanks, and so his cotton khaki uniform was fully drenched in aviation fuel as the plane crashed. And the plane was obviously on fire, and he had to run through this ring of fire to get out of this wreckage of the aircraft. And in so doing, he suffered serious third-degree burns. As I said, he survived another 6 hours, but he passed away that same night on the 18th of August, 1945.
Now, you have mentioned that in this plane there were several survivors. And you have gone through their testimonies, their records. And all of them have pointed to the fact that Netaji was in the plane, that an air crash did take place, that he did die of third-degree burns in a hospital where he was taken. So the proof is based on first-hand testimony, as it were. And it's on record also. Therefore, the question that comes to my mind is, why was this controversy that people cited somebody called Netaji subsequently? I know the controversy over the height, etc. But why was this feeling that he didn't die at that time, when the proof is so incontrovertible and overwhelming?
Well, first of all, I think the Japanese were a little embarrassed about what happened. It also needs to be mentioned, and I've stated it categorically in the book, that no one should have been on that end. It was a defective plane. One of the propellers was a makeshift propeller, let alone a VIP like Subhas Bose, who was treated by the Japanese as a head of government, let alone General Shidei, a senior general of the Japanese army. I don't think anybody should have been on that aircraft. That aircraft was not airworthy, it was not fit to fly. So they were taking a huge risk by going on that plane. This, of course, comes out later in the first-hand testimonies that Pavan mentioned. And these people later recall that this plane was actually standing in a hangar, not really fit for flying, but it was dragged out in an emergency because, as I said, the Japanese were trying to move Subhas away from Southeast Asia to as far north and as far east as possible, so that he would not come under the control of the Allied forces. Now, I think it needs to be understood as to what the state of affairs was in the world at that period of time. News didn't travel on your mobile phone instantly. The actual report of the crash was put out 5 days later. So there was uncertainty, on the part of the Japanese as to whether they should announce this matter or not. These were local officers, commanders of the Japanese forces in Taiwan. And Taiwan, as you know, from 1895 was Japanese territory. And so there was a dilemma as to whether they should announce this at all. So this secrecy that was maintained resulted in about 5 days passing. And ultimately, a Japanese news agency, Domino, put the story out, and then Reuters picked it up in Tokyo and distributed to the rest of the world. Subhas Bose, who was in prison in Kuno at that time, read it in the Hindu and the Indian Express, because all Indian papers had carried the story after Reuters had filed. Now, this uncertainty and then not knowing what the details were, I think caused this mystery, as it were. It was never a mystery, and it should not have been. After the 15th of September, and I say this because 4 weeks later, the Japanese submitted their interim report on the matter. And that report clearly said that, this is what had happened.
Why were the papers kept secret for so long in the government archive?
But that's a very good question. And you, having been a career diplomat, Ambassador Varma should know the answer to that question. But as you know, in India, under the Official Secrets Act, these files were classified. And I think successive governments, when approached on the matter, would give a pretty standard answer, which was really not sustainable. That if these files were opened, it would cause inconvenience in foreign relations, India's foreign relations. It was not the case. And I'm very happy that a few years ago, Narendra Modi, in one of the few good things that he's done in his 4.5 years as head of government, declassified the files. And so it all came tumbling out. The truth is there for people to read in the National Archives in Delhi. So I knew about this, of course, a long time ago, because my work started 30 years ago. By the mid-1990s, I had already reached a firm conclusion that this was what the story was.
For our audience, just explain, what was it in those papers that would embarrass the government of India vis-a-vis which country?
Absolutely nothing. Because now that the papers are out, there is absolutely nothing in any of the files which could embarrass India or any other country.
That brings us to another question, and which is the dynamics of the Congress party itself. I mean, it's known that Netaji and the then top Congress leadership, which included Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, had a difference of opinion on terms of strategy and tactics with which to achieve independence. In spite of that, I may say, and this is something that we need to remember today, if you read the letters between Jawaharlal Nehru and Netaji, and they are 4-page, 5-page long letters, while they disagree, they do so with utmost civility, with respect for each other, and I would say even with transparent affection for each other. But there was a difference of opinion. And Mahatma Gandhi, in a particular situation, always chose Nehru over Netaji. And with Netaji, he had real issues of the use of a violent uprising against the British because of his policy of ahimsa or non-violence. Now, given that, was the Congress leadership after independence likely to be embarrassed by more details coming out in the public realm on how a great son of the soil, a revolutionary, a man who still commands almost hero worship, who is revered by people for his courage and his valor, the manner in which he died? Was it something that would have embarrassed the government subsequently?
No, I think what really happened was that Jawaharlal Nehru went on the back foot on this, because after he instituted the first official Indian inquiry.
There have been 3 commissions.
Yes, but the third is not recognized. It was rejected by the government. The first 2 were officially accepted by the government. Khosla and the Shahnawaz Khan inquiry. So in 1956, which was 11 years after the incident, when the first inquiry took place, I think the findings of the inquiry were met with some amount of skepticism by members of Bose's extended family and also his more fanatical followers. So to bring the remains back to India, which is what the purpose of the inquiry was, I think, fizzled out as a result of this hostile reaction that took place. The only Indian Prime Minister who has ever attempted to bring the remains to India is Narasimha Rao. And this I can say because I was involved in this effort. Behind the scenes, I never talked about it till Modi declassified the files and my correspondence with Prime Minister Narasimha Rao came into the open. Now, as I said, by 1995, I had reached a firm conclusion that A, he had died as a result of a crash, and the mortal remains which are at Renkoji temple are his. And an effort was made. Pranab Mukherjee was then External Affairs Minister, but there again, I think the Home Ministry, the Ministry of External Affairs was in favor of bringing the remains to India. But the Home Ministry in Delhi put a spanner in the works. They referred the matter to the Intelligence Bureau. And the Intelligence Bureau reported back that let the remains lie where they are, because if you bring them back, there could be riots in the streets of Calcutta. I think it was a ridiculous suggestion, and it was actually trying to underplay the overwhelming majority of people in India who are reasonable, rational people, who accept the facts. A tiny group has resisted the ashes from coming back to India. And I do believe, as I said at the very beginning, that it has been criminal neglect. Because here, whether you agree with Bose's politics or not, was one of the great heroes of the Indian freedom movement. And I think it has been cruel to his wife, who died without closure on the matter. And today his daughter, his sole heir, only child, she's 76, has been appealing to the Indian government to do something to bring the ashes to India so that there is, according to her, as she puts it, a final closure, a performance of final rites as per Hindu tradition, because she says her father was a Hindu and that's the way the final disposal ought to happen. The second point she makes is that her father's ambition was to return to an independent India. So at least his remains should touch the soil of India. And I think these are very emotional points that she has made.
So, yeah, we'll come back. We'll come to you the moment we finish. And we are going to finish shortly because the session began late, so we are truncating it. The question is the Japanese government resisting the return, or has the Indian government not pursued it sufficiently with the Japanese government?
Yes, and that's a very good question, because the Japanese government has no problem whatsoever to hand over the remains to India. But they have always maintained that the request must come from the government.
So I think it's criminal that, especially after your book and the findings that you make public, which have been known to those who have been privy to this matter, I think that, do you think that if the ashes came back and a suitable, befitting memorial was built in the memory of this great enduring figure of the Indian freedom movement, if such a memorial was to be built with its ashes coming back to India, which symbolically, metaphorically, substantively would be the fulfillment of what he wanted, do you think it would create any problems within India?
I don't think so. In fact, this matter was discussed when Pranab Mukherjee went and met his widow in Germany in 1995 as to whether a memorial should be...
One thing is the view of the widow, I mean his daughter. But do you think that there is a critical mass of opinion in India which still believes that the story that we know and which you have concluded conclusively now given in your book that he died during 1945. Do you think that there is a critical mass in India that does not believe that story and therefore would not like ashes that are purportedly or supposedly in his name to be brought back?
I don't think there's a critical mass, but I would appeal to the Chief Minister of West Bengal, Mamata Banerjee, to kindly take a look at the facts, because I think she is a stumbling block today.
In what way? Explain.
She is the person who thinks that he escaped to the Soviet Union and did not die as a result of the crash. I don't think she's seen the papers or the documentary evidence that there is on the subject. I would request her fervently to take a look at the papers.
Is a conclusion based on empirical facts? Is it emotional? Is it populist? Is it somewhat reflective of popular opinion in Bengal?
Well, she's made a number of public statements where she uses the term that there's, quote, a Russian angle, unquote. It could be some amount of populism, because there are parts of Bengal where people have been persuaded to Subhas not having perished as a result.
So what is the
of
alternative theory? If he did not die in that air crash, what is supposed to have happened with him? Even if he went to Russia, why did he not surface again?
Well, this is it. The story that has gone around among many conspiracy theories was that he was done in by Stalin in the Soviet Union, in Siberia. So the Indian government, as recently as Narendra Modi, went and asked Vladimir Putin as to whether this was true or not. That question should never have been asked, for the simple reason that Russia has given categorical replies twice in the 1990s, when Narasimha Rao was Prime Minister, where they clearly stated that Subhas Bose never entered the Soviet Union in or after 1945. End of story.
Okay, two last questions before we open it up to questions. Do you think that post-independence, for long periods the Congress party was in power, and we had Jawaharlal Nehru and other leaders, but including Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi and so on. Do you think there's been, I ask this also to you personally as a member of the larger Netaji Bose Parivar, do you think there has been a neglect of the legacy, memory, remembrance of Netaji in India?
You could say that his absence has caused an oversight. One thing needs to be clear. Subhas Bose never left the Indian National Congress. Forward Bloc was a group within the Indian National Congress. Bose was twice elected president of the Indian National Congress. Even during his heady days as the commander of the Indian National Army, he would constantly appeal to the Congress, give suggestions over broadcasts that he used to make from Southeast Asia. His three brigades, the brigades of the INA, were called Gandhi, Nehru and Azad. So he was never out of the Congress.
So in spite of this, Gandhi, Nehru, Azad, do you think the Congress party's leadership has been neglectful to his memory or to the eminence or prominence he needed to have been given in India in the post-independence years?
I think that's a fair point, that they could have given him more importance that has been extended to him since independence. But as I said, it was his absence that has partly caused the oversight. But at the same time, he, having been one of the stalwarts of the Indian National Congress, and I put him in the top three, Gandhi, Nehru.
Where was he cremated?
He was cremated in Tibet.
in Taipei, and then his ashes were carried.
Hand carried by a Japanese officer called Hayashida to Tokyo.
And last question now. In the fractious politics of today, where different leaders of the pantheon of the freedom movement are being appropriated by different political parties, and Sardar Patel comes to mind in that context. Do you think Netaji is also one of the prime candidates for appropriation for solely short-term political gains?
I think he already is, although it is ridiculous to even attempt such appropriation for the simple reason that the extreme right wing cannot claim a left wing patriot as their own.
Well said. So I'm going to open this to questions, except to end by saying that I think that if the facts that I have gone through in this book, which are in the public domain, are true, then the fact that the ashes of one of the greatest sons of the soil who sacrificed his life to get India freedom, one of the most brilliant men of that era, the fact that his ashes are still in Japan and have not been brought back home is a crying shame. And I think our government should do more to get his remains back. That's my conclusion, but it's for governments to decide. Now I'll open it up to questions. There was the lady who wanted to ask even while the discussion was on. Is there a mic here? Is there a mic here?
You mentioned embarrassment of any foreign government regarding this. But I think, of course, it's not only a case of embarrassment, but criminal negligence. Indian government should have asked the accountability. They should have used this weapon of accountability against the Japanese. Why did they do it? It was criminal negligence, carelessness committed in the case of a man, a leader, which you have already, about whom you have already spoken with so much reverence. He was a brilliant leader. He was a...
Got the question.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yes, I understand.
Let the
what you're
Japanese
saying.
be held
Yeah.
accountable.
No, I don't think it was deliberate. So what happened was...
There is no question of deliberateness here.
You use the term...
Let him answer, madam.
you use the term criminal negligence. I wouldn't describe it as such. It was an accident.
And the propeller they knew was not functioning.
And it was not deliberate on the part of the Japanese that they put him on that plane.
What about
it was an extraordinary state of affairs in that theatre of the world. In the immediate aftermath of the Japanese surrender, Japan was in a state of shock. What they were doing or not doing was something which today we should not be going into. All I will say is that the facts are that there was a defect in one of the propellers of that aircraft. That is the propeller that fell off and the plane crashed. So today, in hindsight, we can say this because we have the evidence to do so. But it was certainly not deliberate on the part of Japan. Japan has been terribly embarrassed by what happened. But also, we've been looking after the ashes for so many years. So we do owe a debt to Japan.
But they never...
Okay, madam, we can't have a dialogue, please. Can you pass the mic to the gentleman?
Just out of interest, what do you think the opinions are of the other members of the family, extended family, like Professor Subhas Bose and Krishna Bose? What do they think about this fact you have just produced?
Well, both the names you mentioned, they are on the same page as I am.
Next question.
Thank you.
We'll go to the back. Young man, give the mic to the gentleman there. Please make your questions brief.
Would it be possible to get some DNA answers from the ashes without bringing them here?
In 1995, when I approached Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, I made this suggestion that perhaps a DNA test ought to be attempted. Because among my findings, which has now been confirmed, was that Habibur Rahman, I should mention this, Colonel Habibur Rahman was Subhas Bose's ADC. He was on that flight and he survived the crash. He did suffer serious burn injuries, but he did survive. And so, after the cremation, he was given a piece of paper, and wrapped inside that piece of paper was a tooth. So, this tooth had been extracted before the cremation took place. So, Habib didn't know what to do with it. What he did was he put it in the urn. So even if a DNA test of cremated remains is not possible, it may still be possible because science has advanced by leaps and bounds. But certainly that tooth is there because thereafter it has been established that that tooth exists in a little packet, paper packet inside the urn with the remains. So I did suggest this in 1995, but since 1995, the evidence that I have is 4 times what I had in 1995. There are 11 different investigations, each and every one reaching the same conclusion. 3 Japanese inquiries, 3 British inquiries, 4 Indian inquiries, 1 Taiwanese inquiry, all reaching the same conclusion. I personally now feel a DNA test is not necessary, but if it satisfies everyone.
Can you imagine the embarrassment if by a 5% chance the DNA test is inconclusive, or once the fact that it is not him, it will create a very major problem.
Yes, I know that has been taken into account. I would say that in my case I am confident enough that a DNA test on that uncremated tooth will establish that the remains are his.
Last 2 questions. I'll give it to the lady at the back because I'll take the front. I'll come.
How many have the files been declassified completely, or are there still portions that remain classified? That's the first one. And the second quick one is, what can the family or you as a historian do to remove Netaji out of the right-wing orbit that he seems to be being appropriated by right now?
So 2 questions. To answer your second question first, I don't think he can be pushed into right-wing orbit.
It's happening before our eyes, sir.
It is being attempted, but as I said, rationality will prevail, and I don't think he can be pushed into
Rationality
that.
doesn't prevail in politics, but
Sorry, your first point was...
The files, have they all been declassified?
Yes, everything has been declassified. This has been stated officially by 2 persons. One is Modi himself, and the other is Jai Shankar, who was Foreign Secretary until quite recently. So every single file has been declassified.
okay, we'll take one last question. Maybe if that's the only one remaining, I'll give it to you, but I'll first give it to you.
Hello. In one of the BBC documentary, I heard that there is association with Netaji and Hitler. Is it true?
You mean whether they
He
met
was
or
going
not?
to see Hitler.
Yes, he did meet Hitler. there was that one and only meeting which took place between the two in 1942 in Berlin. Bose and he, of course, disagreed on practically everything. It was a fractious meeting, and Bose had sought Germany's help for the Indian freedom struggle, which Hitler was not prepared to extend, certainly not recognize a free India movement officially. And ultimately, after the meeting, Bose was asked by a Bengali friend as to what he thought of Hitler. And he said, and I suppose most of you are Bengalis, he said, "Boddo pago." So there you have.
Okay, last question to this gentleman.
Actually, all these declassified files does indicate anything? Any facts related to the riddle, rather I would say the riddle. And no government, Indian government, was eager or rather willing to recognize the contribution of the Netaji.
If you are talking about the riddle, as I said, there is no riddle. Because 4 weeks after his death, the Japanese authorities confirmed the fact that he had died as a result of the plane crash. So the files reflect precisely that he died as a result of the crash, and all the details that there are connected with the subject.
Do the present government recognize this fact?
Sorry, which government?
This present government recognize this fact?
Yes, there was a reply given by this government to an RTI question that was put to them last year. And the answer was quite categorical, that he died as a result of the crash. And the remains that are at Renkoji Temple in Tokyo are his.
Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure talking to you, Ashis. I think more people should do the kind of meticulous research that you have put in order to clearly establish the more recent facts of history and prevent the narrative of history being overtaken by emotion. I thank you very much for the session, and I thank you all for being here. Thank you.